hope you're all doing okay. Welcome to our penultimate class of content. We are getting really close to the end. We're at the Enlightenment now, and this is the social and political movement which directly precedes the French Revolution. It's where we start thinking like modern people. So it's a pretty massive social change. We hinted a little bit at it with the Scientific Revolution, which was the last class that we had in person. So if you go back to that, your notes from that class, we talked a little bit about how the Scientific Revolution transformed Europe because people started questioning old held assumptions, or auctoritas, the idea of authority. And that was applied to the natural world. But now we're going to see people challenging authority in the social world as well too, in the political world. Why do we have to have kings? Is that the best way for us to organize ourselves? Really modern ideas. And the other super exciting thing I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be explaining to you why I think coffee is the most important substance to the modern world. In fact, without coffee, we wouldn't have the modern world at all. So why don't you pull yourself a cup of joe and hang on as we explore Unit 11, the Age of Enlightenment. Okay, first, let's do a little bit of review. How did we get to this moment in time? So if we go back to when we were learning about the Middle Ages, we talked about how in the 12th century things began to change in Europe. First of all, we had the medieval warming period, and this allowed for farming to be more productive. That meant that the population began to increase. We also saw that because Europe was at peace, long-distance trade became prevalent again, and all of this leads to the rebirth of cities. More and more people begin to move to cities, and cities become important again. And inadvertently, the rise of cities actually breaks down the simplistic structure of medieval society. We have this new group of people that don't fit into that threefold division of medieval society. The threefold division, of course, was the peasants, those that work, the nobles, those that fight, and the clergy, those that pray. Instead, now we have the townsfolk, or the bourgeoisie. And we saw that, at least in the south of Italy, those townsfolk eventually start sending their children to be educated, and this ultimately leads to the Renaissance. A new group of people who are now literate, who are interested in different things, such as the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. All of this, aided by the printing press, will spread across Europe. And this new group of people ultimately begins their path to becoming what we might think of as a middle class. Also, as a result of the Renaissance and the increased literacy of the Renaissance, we have the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, aided by the printing press as well, ultimately was a result of increased literacy. As more people were able to read, more people began to come up with their own ideas about how they want to worship. Now, all of that questioning will ultimately lead to the challenging of traditional authorities in the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution saw some of the old ancient authorities, their ideas about how nature and the universe work, be overthrown. People like Ptolemy, people like Galen, people like Aristotle, they were proven to be wrong. And as ideas like the heliocentric universe that Copernicus proposed, and all the people that followed, including Galileo with his observations through the telescope, and eventually culminating with Isaac Newton with Principia, where he essentially laid down the rules of modern physics that we still use today in our science. And so the scientific revolution was challenging the way people thought about the natural world, and it challenged authorities that were held to be authorities in that world. So ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, their ideas, which had been held in high regard for so long, finally began to be challenged. So the Enlightenment is something that occurs really alongside the scientific revolution. And instead of questioning authorities about the natural world, it's questioning authorities about our world, our social world, our political world. It asks fundamental questions about how human beings organize themselves. So the Enlightenment really, it begins in the 18th century, and it will have a profound effect. It will result in real social change. It will result in two major revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So it's a pretty big deal, and it's really what makes us think like modern people. It introduces us to new ideas such as human rights and freedom of religion and freedom of expression, separation of church and state. All of those ideas, which are really fundamental to a Western liberal democracy, come about as a result of the Enlightenment. Now, the center of the Enlightenment, ironically, is one place where kings were becoming super powerful, and really there was this top-down structure which did not allow for much, calls for social change, and that's France. In France, in the parlors of France, we have the first real discussions that start to push forward the Enlightenment, and they're led by people who describe themselves as philosophes. Philosophe is really just, someone who has enough money to be spending their time thinking deep thoughts. And really, the Enlightenment is driven by this new, wealthy, upper middle class group of people. So these are people who are rich like nobles, but they don't have noble names. They're part of this, breaking down of society that's been happening for a few hundred years at this point in time. This is a painting which shows one of the great Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire, visiting with the great Prussian leader Frederick the Great, and discussing some of the new philosophies and points of ideas. So the Enlightenment philosophers often spread their ideas by traveling around, and in some cases, rulers invited them in. Not all rulers were hostile towards new ways of thinking, particularly when it came to efficiencies in government and reorganizing the state. We'll see how some rulers would even embrace the ideas of the Enlightenment, at least a little bit. But of course, the Enlightenment ultimately challenges all the old style rulers, all of the old style kings that derived their rule by birthright. The Enlightenment will challenge their very authority. So in review, the Enlightenment is applying the principles of the scientific revolution to political and social thought. And it is really directly tied to the scientific revolution. In many cases, it's the same people who are contributing to the scientific revolution are also contributing to the Enlightenment. People don't, categorize themselves the same way we would. I'm a scientist. I'm a politician. People didn't think of it that way. Philosophers really were just people who were interested in intellectual ideas. And so you could imagine a philosopher one day debating about the heliocentric universe and the next day talking about whether we need kings or not. Really what we see throughout the scientific revolution is this critical spirit, this questioning spirit, and above all, a real optimism about where we're going. An optimism that somehow we as humans can get it all sorted out and we'll come up with the perfect society where everyone is equal and everything is just hunky-dory. And as we already said, France was at the center of the Enlightenment. It's the philosophers in France who set the standard and really export these ideas throughout the rest of Europe. And as I had mentioned as well, there's a bit of a mixed reaction from rulers, at least initially. Some rulers across Europe embrace aspects of the Enlightenment to do with efficiencies in government and even equality under the law, as long as it keeps them still in power. Other rulers, on the other hand, will deeply distrust the Enlightenment, and probably, from a purely pragmatic point of view, they were the smart ones, because the Enlightenment obviously will lead to the downfall of absolute rulers just about everywhere. So I want to begin just by talking about some of the major writers and thinkers of the Enlightenment. So the first person I want to talk about is John Locke. He is an early Enlightenment thinker, and he really influences all the later philosophers that are to come, even though John Locke is actually not French. I just spent all this time telling you that France is at the center of it all. But I suppose John Locke, he's the one who starts it all, so maybe we shouldn't be thinking France is the end-all and be-all. In any respect, John Locke, he came up with this concept called the social contract. And it really was revolutionary in its time. It's a simple idea at its heart. The idea is that kings don't rule by divine right. They're not ruling because God appointed them into that position, but rather they rule with a bargain of sorts with the people. The bargain posits that kings have responsibilities. One of those responsibilities might be to maintain the peace of the realm, to make sure that the people are safe, They also probably should be providing justice, a fair and equitable justice system to the people. On the other side of the bargain are the people, and they have responsibilities too. Responsibility to be good citizens and to follow the law and to not get into trouble, that sort of thing. And if needed, maybe to even come in and protect the kingdom by filling positions in the army, for example, during a time of war. This is the idea of the social contract. It's a balance between the people and the ruler. Now, this is revolutionary for the time because kings don't think that way. Kings don't think I have responsibilities to my people. My people do what I tell them to do. I mean, certainly that's the way Louis XIV would have considered it. Louis XIV was l'état c'est moi. I am the state. God himself appoints me into this role. So the idea that there is some sort of bargain or a contract between the people and the king is really a new idea. And see, the thing about contracts is that if one side is not fulfilling their end of the bargain, then the other side could be justified in breaking that contract, and in this case, overthrowing a king. Now that is really where John Locke's ideas start getting us into a path that might eventually lead to revolution. John Locke is also sometimes called the father of classic liberalism. So liberalism, especially if you've taken the second half of this course, Modern Europe, liberalism during the 19th century will become a major force, one of the major sort of competing ideas on the political landscape in Europe. Now, when we talk about liberalism in the 18th and 19th century, we're not using the word the way it is used today. And this is, I would just want to emphasize this. So if I use the word liberal today, it has a particular political context. It usually means someone who is on the left side of the political spectrum, or maybe I'm even talking about a specific political party in Canada, so like the Liberal Party of Canada. But that is not how the word was used in the 18th and 19th century. So liberalism back then implies essentially the types of ideas that John Locke was originating, which is the idea that government should have limited power. So government should only be empowered to the degree that the law allows them to be, and only so that they can fulfill the end of their contract, their social contract. And thus, under liberalism, individuals have rights. And so this is the classic idea of liberalism, that we have individual rights with a small, limited government. And this new idea from John Locke will basically run under much of the Enlightenment thinking of the 18th century, and definitely will continue to be a profound force during the 19th century as well. So the next person I want to talk about is Voltaire. And Voltaire is probably the most famous person when it comes to the Enlightenment. When people talk about the Enlightenment, they usually use Voltaire as the example. Voltaire was famous in his own time. When he wasn't running away from rulers who wanted to imprison him because of his ideas, he was traveling all around Europe and hobnobbing with the rich and the famous. And spreading these crazy new ideas of the Enlightenment. So, of course, Voltaire is not his real name. He was born François-Marie Arouet, and so that was what his mother called him. But like Zendaya or Madonna or a Drake, he took on a pen name. So his name was Voltaire. He also was from the middle class, this new sort of wealthy upper middle class group of people, which so many of the Enlightenment thinkers come from. And his main ideas, and he had lots of writings, but his main ideas that we take away from are concepts like the freedom of religion. Now that would have been really revolutionary at the time. Most people thought it was detrimental to a society to have people living together who believed different things with respect to religion. It was thought that that ultimately would constantly lead to strife, and that it was better to separate people. And certainly it would be best for a state to enforce one religion. That would have been, generally thought to be a good thing. And he argued, no. It's best to have freedom of religion where everyone can worship as they choose. And following that, he also believed freedom of expression, that people should be able to say and think what they want. And he also believed in the idea of the separation of church and state. Now, there was no separation of church and state in that time. Rulers were religious. They often had very close relationships with the heads of the church. And there was no concept that they should be ruling sort of in a secular point of view, like ruling for all people regardless of their religion. But if you're going to have freedom of religion, it follows then that you need to have a state that is neutral as well, a neutral arbitrator. And so these are ideas that I would say, are fundamental to all Western democracies today. We all generally, in Canada and other places, we believe in freedom of religion. We believe in freedom of expression, and we certainly believe in the separation of church and state. The next person I want to talk about is Montesquieu. He also has a very, very long name, which I'm not even going to read here. It's not a pen name. He's just, because his name is so long, it's just easier to call him Montesquieu. And he is one of the few people of the Enlightenment who is actually part of the nobility. So it wasn't all people from the upper middle class, but there were some people who were part of the old noble families. And Montesquieu's great contribution to the concepts being talked about in the Enlightenment was the three-part separation of powers in government. A lot of Western democracies essentially are modeled under this system, particularly the United States. The United States was, of course, a country built on Enlightenment ideas, and the American Revolution directly comes out of the Enlightenment, and the people who are organizing it were essentially people participating in these ideas, like talking about these ideas. And so the idea of the three-part separation of government is we don't have all power invested in one person. Even if that person's elected, we don't invest all power in one person. Instead, we separate the power between at least three different groups, each with checks and balances on the other. That way, any one group can't become corrupt. Or if they do become corrupt, the other two groups will have a check on their power. So under Montesquieu's conception, we would have an executive, a legislative, and a judicial. So under the United States, the executive would be the president, say, and the legislative would be Congress. And judicial would be the Supreme Court systems. Now, under the American system, technically each of those groups is equal. They all have checks and balances on each other. So if the president is too crazy, theoretically at least, the legislative group could impeach the president and remove the president from power. However, the executive has power too. Any law that the legislative branch passes has to be signed by the executive. And in fact, the executive, the president, can in fact veto any legislation if he or she doesn't like it. So that's a check on power in the legislative. The judicial also has checks on both of the other two groups. They interpret laws, and if they also are the ones calling goals and strikes in terms of adherence to the Constitution. So each of these groups has power over the other. And we essentially see a similar type of system in Canada. We also have a Supreme Court. We also have a legislative system. The only difference is in Canada and other parliamentary democracies, it gets a little bit confusing because our executive doesn't really have much power. Our executive is not the Prime Minister, but rather the Queen. And the Queen doesn't really have power. So really, real power is invested in the Prime Minister, who is part of the legislative group. So it's a little bit more complicated in Canada, which is why some people have argued that under parliamentary systems like Britain and Canada, Australia, the Prime Minister actually has more power, relatively speaking, than a president does under a Republican system like in the United States. Next person I want to talk about is Adam Smith. So he was Scottish. Adam Smith is usually called the father of modern economics. His main contribution was just thinking about economics in general. Economics is, of course, the study of monetary policy at a macro level, so at the level of countries. And this was not something that people really thought about. They thought of business as very local, or they thought about taxes, but they didn't really think about how everything connects to one another. His basic philosophy was laissez-faire economics, which is sometimes called the invisible hand. Laissez-faire means let it go. And Adam Smith believed that the best way for an economy to be successful, for as many people as possible to be benefiting from the economy, government needs to stay out of the way. So he was, of course, reacting to mercantilism, which was the norm at the time, that countries very strictly controlled their economies. They said who you could trade with, the colonies could only trade with the mother country, etc., etc. We've talked about mercantilism in the class before. And Adam Smith said, no. The best way would be to have no rules whatsoever, laissez-faire economics. And under that, the invisible hand will keep the economy humming away. So his main book is The Wealth of Nations, where he argued that nations essentially would do best if they are existing on a free and open market, and thus some nations will be better at certain things than others, and naturally we will see specialization, and this will result in the lowest prices for things. It will result in the most efficiency in the market, and ultimately the most amount of people will be wealthy. Now, there's plenty of people who disagree with Adam Smith. Adam Smith's ideas, though, are still held as the beginning of economics. This whole discipline of economics starts essentially with Adam Smith. The final person I want to talk about is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who is incredibly important, particularly because he has a huge influence on the French Revolution. I mean, his ideas were put directly into play in the French Revolution. Now, he himself didn't actually live to see the French Revolution. I suspect he might have been horrified at the things that were done using the same terms that he'd come up with. Two of his main works were The Origin on Inequality and On the Social Contract. His main idea was this concept called the general will. And in it, he sort of developed further from John Locke's social contract idea. Instead, actually said that kings actually only rule at the behest of the general will. That means that the people essentially allow the king and can withdraw that permission if they so choose. The general will is essentially the idea of almost like majority rules, essentially. So it's the collective voice of the people. Now, during the French Revolution, though, the general will do terrible things. The general will be invoked, sending people to their death at the guillotine. The general will compel people to fight in the army. All kinds of really nasty things will actually happen in the French Revolution, and they'll call it the general will. Okay, so now I want to make this argument for you that coffee is the most important substance in the modern world. And in fact, the modern world wouldn't exist without coffee. So now, if you don't have a cup of coffee, it's a good time to pause this podcast. Go make yourself a really nice cup of coffee in your social distancing. So don't go to Starbucks, because Starbucks isn't open. Make a coffee at home. If all you've got is instant, well then just make yourself an instant coffee. Because, hold on, we're now going to talk about how coffee changes everything. So coffee is an old world crop. You know, we talked about with the Columbian Exchange how all kinds of new products from the Americas came into Europe that they hadn't known before, things like chocolate, things like tomatoes or potatoes. But coffee actually is an old world product. We believe the natural coffee plant originates in Africa, probably around Kenya. And that's probably where it was domesticated for the first time. We think maybe around the 11th century or so. Now, there's a legend associated with how coffee was discovered. Apparently, a shepherd was attending to his flock of goats or sheep. There's different versions of the story. And he noticed that when they ate the red berries of this particular plant, they got very excited and danced around. And so the shepherd then tried it himself, and thus coffee was born. So when coffee houses begin to appear in Europe in the 16th century, it's not just coffee that's coming into Europe for the first time. There are also two other new drinks, at least from the point of view of Europeans, three new stimulants, and they're all sort of spreading into Europe at the same time. There's coffee, and then there's tea, of course. Now, tea comes from Asia, and it's thousands of years old, but it was new to Europeans, and it begins to come into Europe around the exact same time. And another stimulant drink, and I say drink, is chocolate. For the vast majority of chocolate's history, it was a drink, a beverage, very like coffee. Cacao, which is the plant from which chocolate is made, contains theobromine, and theobromine is a related compound to caffeine. It has a similar effect on the human nervous system. It's not quite as strong, but it is a stimulant beverage. And so before it was turned into a solid and sweetened with sugar, chocolate at its heart is a very bitter beverage, not unlike coffee. In any respect, all three of these beverages are beginning to circulate into Europe at the same time. It'll be coffee, though, that will ultimately be the most successful and be the one with the biggest influence. So it's first introduced to Europe around in the 1500s. And it came into Europe vis-a-vis the Islamic world. So if we imagine coffee being domesticated in Africa sometime around the 11th century, it spreads throughout Africa and then into the Islamic world sometime probably in the late Middle Ages. and then Europeans would have experienced it somewhat later. It spread very quickly. Once it enters into Europe, we start seeing coffee houses pop up all over the place. By the mid 17th century, all the major cities have several coffee houses. So here's an image of a coffee house in the Islamic world. This is a 16th century manuscript of men drinking coffee. Coffee was successful in the Islamic world, partially because it's a beverage that's not alcohol, because alcohol, of course, was prohibited for most Muslims. And coffee was something that was permitted. And in fact, it was so successful that it even, some have argued, is the reason why we started to see a greater emphasis on night prayers in some Islamic sects. And here you see an image of a European coffee shop with lots of men in white wigs enjoying their cup of joe. One thing to note is that there's no women in this image. And indeed, although it's a little bit confusing whether women were allowed or not allowed into coffee shops, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but coffee houses were predominantly a male cultural phenomenon in Europe. So when coffee first begins circulating in Europe, it causes a lot of controversy. People don't really know what it is, what this substance does. There's all kinds of crazy ideas. Some people believed it was an aphrodisiac. Others believed it caused impotence. You notice here on the right side, the women's petition against coffee, representing to public consideration the grand inconveniences accorded to their sex from the excessive use of that drying, enfeebling liquor. Essentially, this was an argument that women were pissed off that their husbands were drinking coffee, and thus they weren't able to perform their husbandly duties. Were women forbidden from coffee shops? Well, there's a lot of scholarly thought about this. Maybe, maybe not. We think likely that women above a certain social standing would have not wanted to be seen in a coffee shop. That it would have been sort of more, would have been considered uncouth for them to appear in a coffee shop. Whereas women below a certain station, it didn't really matter. But we do have some examples of even women owning coffee shops. So we think that it certainly wasn't a blanket policy. In fact, for women during the early modern period, tea will ultimately become a much more important drink than coffee, partially because of this association with coffee being something that is, an intoxicant or a dark liquor. Sometimes it was associated with the devil. So there was a lot of really strange ideas floating around about coffee in the early days. But one thing that I think is underappreciated about what coffee did for Europe at that time was the beginning of night culture. You see, this is the very first stimulant beverage that Europeans have had access to. Traditionally, Europeans drank two things. They drank water and they drank beer. And they drank a lot of beer. Beer during the Middle Ages was considered safer than water, and in many cases it was, because the process of making beer would actually kill a lot of the microbes and nastiness that you might just find if you were drinking water out of a stream running through London, which would be pretty darn gross during the Middle Ages, let me tell you. So beer actually was a safer drink for most Europeans, and everybody drank it. They drank it for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner. Kids drank beer. Now, obviously, the beer that they were drinking was a much weaker beer than we would have, probably about 1 or 2%. But let me tell you, if you're just spending your day drinking beer, you're not going to have a scientific revolution. You're going to be, kind of like, I'm going to take it easy. Coffee changes things a little bit because in the night now we have an ability to stay up. And some people have argued that night culture doesn't really exist to the same degree until coffee comes into play. So with this beginning of night culture, coffee becomes controversial for another reason, and that's that people are getting together in coffee shops, and what are they talking about in there? Maybe they're talking about revolution, or they're talking about, just things that kings would rather people not be talking about. In fact, Charles II, you see a picture of him there, tried to shut down all coffee houses in the country in 1675 in England. Now, you remember Charles II, his father, Charles I, had his head cut off. So he was arguably, a little bit nervous about what people might be talking about in coffee shops. The problem for Charles is that coffee houses were so popular, even his own ministers attended coffee houses. He said coffee houses were places where the disaffected met and spread scandalous reports. In any respect, his plan to shut down coffee houses did not work. So the reason why Charles II had such a tough time shutting down coffee houses is because they had become a communication hub. It's in coffee houses that you would go to hear news from abroad. Coffee houses had become essentially the equivalent of an 18th century internet. That's what many historians have described it as. They were places where unregulated academic discussion and exchange of all sorts of ideas could take place. And all of the major thinkers of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment patronized coffee houses. You could, in fact, argue that the scientific revolution took place in coffee houses. This is where the ideas were hashed out. Take, for example, Principia, which is Isaac Newton's seminal work, which is, for most scholars, the pinnacle of the scientific revolution. In Principia, the major theories of the laws of motion and gravity were laid down, and it's because of Principia that we were able to land people on the moon and that we have satellites in space, and why, in fact, we have the internet of the 21st century. That's all because of Principia. According to one story, he didn't come up with Principia because an apple fell on his head from a tree. He came up with it drinking coffee with his buddy Edmund Halley, who you see there, in 1684, that Edmund Halley gave Newton the initial idea for Principia in a coffee house. So it's coffee that we have to thank, not an apple, but coffee. Edmund Halley, by the way, was famous in his own right for his own contributions to the scientific revolution. You may have heard of Halley's Comet. That's the comet that he discovered, which comes by, every 67 years or something like that. Coffee houses actually eventually started to specialize in certain topics. So you would know that if you went to one coffee shop, you might get lectures on physics, or another coffee shop, everyone who was into mathematics would gather to talk about things. So for instance, you see a picture there of the Marine Coffee House, which was a popular London venue for mathematics lectures. In fact, at the time, coffee houses sometimes became known as penny universities, because you could go into a coffee house in Oxford or London, and for paying the price of a cup of coffee, a penny, you could get an education. So coffee houses were becoming more and more important to the idea of modern exchange of these new themes. So coffee houses didn't just become important for places to learn about science or the new ideas about the Enlightenment, but coffee houses also became business hubs as well. London coffee houses in particular became centers for trade and commerce. It's in coffee houses that you could go to find business partners or investors for your new idea. And you would know that in coffee houses you would find other like-minded people where you could trade shares in a company. Coffee houses became places where you could find the current shipping news. So what's coming into port? Should I buy coffee or should I buy sugar? Can I sell it at this rate? I mean, coffee houses became the hubs where all that sort of stuff happened. One coffee house in particular, Jonathan's Coffee House, which was established in 1680. You see a picture of Jonathan's Coffee House there. Became super important. Over time, Jonathan's Coffee House had to keep expanding, and they didn't have enough space for everybody. And eventually, they moved into some new digs and renamed themselves the London Stock Exchange in 1801. So that's right. The very bedrock of how our economies work today with stock markets started in a coffee house. So the London Stock Exchange, one of the first real modern stock exchange, began as a coffee shop named Jonathan's. And in fact, for many years after it moved into its new digs, people still referred to it as New Jonathan's. So the connection to its coffee shop origins was not completely lost. So another important coffee house for business was Lloyd's Coffee House, which opened on Tower Street in London in 1688, founded by Edmund Lloyd. So Lloyd's Coffee House became a really important place for sailors and merchants and ship owners, and Lloyd catered to them with reliable shipping news. So shipping, in the 18th and 17th century was obviously a risky business to be in. Ships weren't that great and they frequently sank. And so, if you were in the shipping business, it was really important to know what was going on. So who was importing what, when would it come into port, et cetera, And also, the problem with shipping, of course, is that it's very expensive. You invest your life savings, say, in bringing in a shipment of cotton from the Americas, and then suddenly your ship sinks. You could lose everything. So it's in places like Lloyd's Coffee House, you might actually take steps to get people to help you out in case you were going to take on the risk of bringing in something. You might find people who might be willing to cover your loss. And so someone might say, hey, I think you've got a pretty strong ship. I'm willing to bet that your ship is going to come in. So if you pay me $100, then I will cover your loss if your ship actually doesn't come in, if it actually sinks. And if it does come in, then I just keep the $100. This was the beginning of insurance. The concept of insurance begins in a coffee house, insuring ships as they come into port. So Lloyd's Coffee House is still around. It's now known as Lloyd's of London. What had begun informally at Lloyd's Coffee House as insurance amongst merchants formally became the Society of Lloyd's in 1774. And just, to give you an example, Lloyd's is like one of the biggest insurance companies in the world now. And in 2018, it held 53.5 billion pounds worth of assets. So they're not really in the coffee business anymore, but they still exist. So Lloyd's of London, which if you were in the UK, you'd know all about Lloyd's of London. I mean, it's huge. It's the big insurance company. Begins in a coffee house. And in fact, the very concept of insurance, so when you're paying your car insurance or whatever other insurance you have, that idea began in a coffee house. So as I was saying, all the major thinkers of the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution, they all went to coffee houses, including Voltaire, who you see here. Voltaire used to brag that he drank 50 cups a day. I don't know how that's possible. It sounds rather dangerous, but that's what he said. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, I love that perfume when they roast it in my entryway. Some of my neighbors close their doors, but I open mine. Also a big fan of coffee. And the American Revolution was planned in coffee houses. We wouldn't have the American Revolution. We wouldn't have a United States of America right now if it wasn't for coffee houses. The British knew this. They called American coffee houses seminaries of sedition. That is, schools where you could learn to be a revolutionary. George Washington and all of his crew, they planned the revolution essentially in coffee houses, particularly one coffee house, the Old London Coffee House in Philadelphia, which you see a picture of here. So, the fact that we have to our south, the country, the United States of America, is the result of coffee. Finally, the French Revolution would not have taken place if it wasn't for coffee houses. The French Revolution is what we've been building for in this course the entire term. It is, for many historians, a demarcation point from which we now enter into the modern world. Well, according to legend, the French Revolution actually was launched when this man, Camille Desmoulins, was having a cup of coffee in the Café de Foy on July 12, 1789, and news came that the king had fired the economic minister who everyone loved and was very popular. And this was the straw that broke the camel's back. He jumped up onto his table, he kicked his coffee over, and he yelled, "To arms! To arms!" And everyone else ran out into the street yelling, "To arms! To arms!" And the French Revolution had began. That's right, you heard it here first. The French Revolution began in the 18th century equivalent of Starbucks. So I hope I've convinced you just how important coffee is to the modern world. Now, there are so many social and political consequences of the Enlightenment, but one of the most important, I think, is the rise of this concept called public opinion. The idea that governments should care about public opinion, that they should be responsive to public opinion, is really an idea born out of the Enlightenment. And it happens because there is now this emergence of a new reading public. More and more people are literate than ever before. There's a greater number of books available. There's now newspapers, magazines, and pamphlets, which are all being sold. This fundamentally is a shift that is happening at the societal level that is a result of the Enlightenment. So as I had indicated at the beginning of the lecture, there actually were a few rulers in Europe that actually were not entirely hostile to the concepts of the Enlightenment. And this is where we get the term enlightened monarchy, or the idea of an enlightened despot, an enlightened despotism. This is the idea that you have a ruler who has taken much of the ideas of the Enlightenment and allowed society to change beneath them, but they themselves remain in power. So one example of someone who was at least receptive to the Enlightenment is the leader of Prussia, Frederick II, or Frederick the Great. He considered himself, or considered the monarch rather, as the first servant of the state. Now that sounds a lot like John Locke's idea of the social contract. And so you do see some leaders that are responsive to the ideas in the Enlightenment. As long as they stay in power, as long as they have full power, then you do see, a little bit of a nod towards the Enlightenment. A despot is just someone who is all powerful. So an enlightened despot is a slightly nicer version of a despot. Another example of a leader who is responsive to the Enlightenment is Catherine the Great in Russia. So Catherine actually wrote a book which was inspired by the Enlightenment called Instruction or Instructions. And in it, she basically argued that law should be supreme, not necessarily the leader, and that people should be equal to a degree underneath the leader. The leader, though, still remains the leader. The leader still remains all powerful. Also, Catherine was interested in many of the other ideas in the Enlightenment about efficiency and organizing governments to be more modern in many, many respects. But, we still see in Russia that they had serfdom. So Russia is, a whole case study in irony, I suppose, and that you do have people like Catherine the Great and also Peter the Great as well, who we talked about in the last lecture. He was also, to a degree, also inspired by some ideas in the Enlightenment. And at the same time, we just have these old, archaic structures, legal structures such as serfdom, continuing at the same time. So Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great of Prussia, these are two examples of quote-unquote enlightened monarchs. So in conclusion, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment represented a fundamental shift in the European worldview. Growing Enlightenment criticism underlined absolutist power, especially in France. And the seeds were set now for a century of revolution in the Western world. And this is where we're going next week. Our final class of content, the French Revolution, Unit 12, the Revolutionary Age. So if you can, read Chapter 19 for next week. And I look forward to meeting virtually with you one last time before we have the final exam. All right, everyone, stay safe and healthy and have a great week.